moral issues in child labor. So, I mean, in some ways you'd think, well, that's pretty straightforward. Children shouldn't be working. Uh, but it's not that straightforward. I mean, for one thing, children do work in the US, and certainly over vacations and stuff like that. Children are allowed to work. It's legal for 13-year-olds to do a little work. 14, 15-year-olds can do some work. Certainly 16, 17-year-olds can work. They're all officially minors. And then if you actually look at the history of the US and history of kind of humans generally, children have been working for most of human history. So it's actually relatively recent that we've had more prohibitions on children working. So I want to look at US history and law and the ways things have changed. And then we'll get to some of the moral issues. So certainly, like I said, children have worked for most of human history. Certainly, kind of in ancient times, children worked. People helped their families, and for a lot of families, that was one of the reasons to have children, is that your children could work for you. You could then, it was useful to have kids because the kids would make your lives easier. Obviously, in ancient times, most jobs were agricultural. And then for most of like the Middle Ages and for life up to the 19th century, it was totally standard for children to be working. I mean, you can look to the Industrial Revolution and the rise of cities and the rise of city work and factories, but certainly children have been working in rural settings for a long time. And that distinction between rural settings and city work is a fairly important one. Certainly I mean, when children are working for their parents, then parents like that, and parents have control over their children. When children are working for other employers, the employers like that because kids are pretty easy to control. So they don't fight back as much as adults. So, and you can often pay them less. So if you're looking at the US, certainly child labor was an essential part of the economy, both for agricultural and for handicraft. And I think maybe even for factories too. But so certainly children were used a great deal. It wasn't like just a little bit, they were used a lot. Children worked on family farms, so they would work for their families on farms. Obviously, children can do things like pick fruit. They can kind of work on fields with growing products and harvesting products. And also they can feed animals, they can milk cows, maybe they can even herd things, so they're quite good. Children also worked as indentured servants. So servants tend to get not much pay or no pay. Indentured servants, they work under a kind of contract, and generally the idea is for a specified amount of time. I think the classic kind of case of indentured servants in the US was like you would have immigrants, and employers would bring those immigrants over. They would pay for the travel from traveling from another country, and then people would work as servants for a specified amount of time for those employers, and the employer would simply provide the person with food and shelter, and the person would work for almost no money or for no money at all. Now, with children working, I think it could be parents contracting with an employer for the employer to employ their or to take their kids, and they would do that for a certain amount of money, so it would be beneficial to the parents. So that was pretty standard in the US. Boys would learn trades, often beginning at by the age of 10 or 10 to 14. So young children were employed from an early age, and that was very standard in the US. I mean, not everybody was happy with it, and people thought that children should be treated humanely and they should get an education. But certainly that wasn't necessary in most places. And it was, so there was patchy kind of efforts to try and enforce changes. And it wasn't until 1904 that there was a National Child Labor Committee formed, trying to regulate state child labor committees. So here are a couple of instances of social reform. One of the earliest forms of cases of social reform was 1813, when Connecticut began the first state to enact a child labor law requiring employers to provide some schooling in the areas of reading, writing, and mathematics. So that was 1813. And so Connecticut was unusual in that, but it happened. In 1848, Pennsylvania became the first state to set a minimum age for factory workers, and that minimum age was 12. So presumably there had been 8, 9, 10, 11-year-olds working in factories and were working in factories in other states. And Pennsylvania said, well, that's not right. So they set a minimum age of 12. Now the minimum, that's 12 seems pretty young. But, and there was various laws enacted by various states. So it wasn't until the 20th century that there was a lot of change, and it wasn't until 1938 that the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in the U.S. There was quite a lot of effort in earlier decades to pass laws, and laws were in fact passed in like the teens, but then they were there was appeals to those laws. Various states, especially southern states, resisted reform, and the Supreme Court struck those laws down. So there's interesting constitutional issues about whether child labor laws were even constitutional in terms of states' rights. And the fact that southern states resisted the reform, obviously slavery was no longer legal in southern states in the 20th century, but you still had plenty of African American black workers working in southern states in agriculture, and so you had a lot of children working in agriculture, and that meant that so in some ways it was still a legacy of slavery, and the southern states didn't want to have a change. So it was in 1938, which is after the Great Depression, that seemed to have some effect. Partly there was massive unemployment, and so I think one of the reasons that child labor laws became more popular is that adults wanted to be guaranteed jobs, and they didn't want to have to compete with kids. If kids were working for lower wages, then the adults didn't want to have to compete with those kids. So there was more support for child labor laws because it was better for adults. So the child labor laws ensured that when young people work, the work is safe and should not jeopardize their health, well-being, or educational opportunities. And still, that 1938 law is the main child labor law which is in force in the United States now. Now, the fact they enacted laws in 1938 didn't mean that everything changed overnight. There were certainly exceptions in those laws. Children, here's a couple of exceptions. Children 12 and 13 years old could work with parents' permission outside of school hours. So I guess, so that, I mean, would that be full-time or not? I think in some ways now, even now, children 12 and 13 can still work in agricultural work. So like in the tri-state area, there's not so much agricultural work, although I guess in like out east on Long Island, there's still agriculture. And maybe parts of New Jersey and Connecticut has some agriculture. Certainly there's some stuff going on. And then obviously there's other states where you have a lot of agricultural work. So 12 and 13-year-olds can work outside of school hours. And then if parents had a farm, then they could get their own kids to work on that farm with no restrictions. The other fact was that a lot of states basically didn't enforce the laws, and we'll see that you can have all the laws you want, but if the state doesn't enforce it, then it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. And that's a big issue in 2023 too around the world. So it's actually a little hard to work out what the state of child labor is in the US. Obviously, a lot of teenagers get jobs, right? Maybe especially like summer jobs, maybe other sorts of jobs, and that is perfectly legal. So in 1997, the Department of Labor estimated that more than 4 million children were legally employed. Now, that report suggested that 2 million minors are employed in illegal, often exploitative conditions. 2 million seems like a lot. There's a 2023 estimate that 3,800 children are employed illegally, which is very different from 2 million. So it's hard to work out exactly what the truth is in the US. Certainly in terms of child jobs, one estimate, I mean, and this seems like something that's pretty verifiable. I mean, it's hard to work out how many children are employed illegally, because obviously employers don't say, oh, I'm employing 10 children illegally and 15 children legally. I mean, that's not what happens. So you have to do some sort of, you have to base it on some sort of estimate. But with workers' comp claims, that's easily worked out. And so there's about 20,000 workers' comp claims per year for children, for minors. And for thousands of cases of permanent disability for children. So that doesn't seem great if a child is permanently disabled in work. That's not good. And apparently about 70 deaths each year for children working. So that's not great. So working out exactly what the numbers are in the US right now is a tricky issue. One thing that you see in news, has been in the news in the last year or two, and has been quite well publicized, is that various states are loosening their child labor laws. So you have the federal law, and then you have state law. So states can change their state law. So some states are allowing that children can work for less than the state minimum wage. So in New York State, the minimum wage is $13 for the state and $15 for New York State. It's like, I think it's $13 in New Jersey. Like Alabama, you won't be surprised to learn, has no minimum wage whatsoever. So obviously then there's no minimum wage for kids either. But the idea is that in states, a bunch of states, like I think Kentucky, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. So the idea is if you have a minimum wage, then some children can work for less than that. In Minnesota is pushing to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to be able to work in construction. Construction is hazardous. So the idea is that 16 and 17-year-olds should be allowed to work in hazardous conditions. Now, 18-year-olds and adults can work in hazardous conditions. There are still like OSHA laws, which are about workplace safety. So, some jobs are safe, some jobs are more hazardous. There are still laws governing safety, and the idea is that if you're 16 years old, then you should be able to take that risk for yourself. And in Ohio, the law has been changed already, allowing that 14 and 15-year-olds can work until 9 p.m. during the school year. So like if you're at work at 9 p.m., then presumably you have to get home to your bed. So that means probably you're not getting into bed until at least 10 o'clock. Maybe what if you want to have dinner? So it seems that that may impinge on kids' readiness to be full of energy for school the next day. So let's think about morality, and we'll talk mainly about the three main theories about what they might say about child labor. Now, I guess one of the main things to point out is that, when we went over the big theories, we didn't actually talk about children very much at all. So it's not so clear how they apply to children. We have to kind of think about it ourselves. All right, so let's start with utilitarianism, which says that we should maximize the total happiness or welfare of society and minimize suffering. So it's not clear that utilitarianism would necessarily be against child labor. It's probably going to take it on a case-by-case basis. And we might want to think about which kids are actually better off having a job rather than being at school. And that seems like that's possible. At the level of law, you might want to think about, what laws are actually going to benefit society most? And can we be sure that we should forbid kids from working even full-time? So, is it inevitable that children are better off going to school instead of working? Well, one thing that's obvious is that some, maybe many kids hate school. So maybe if you hate school, maybe you'd be better off with a job. And do schools actually benefit kids? Well, hopefully. But do they benefit all kids? Well, there's quite a few kids who get nothing out of school. And then some schools are just terrible. Right? So if a school is terrible, then what's the point of sending kids to a terrible school? Maybe they'd be better off working. Some schools or some children have traumatic experiences at school. So in fact, it's like you're sent to school, and then people abuse you. People beat you up. Teachers beat you up, maybe, or teachers belittle you. Other kids beat you up and belittle you. There's abuse, there's bullying. Why should we force kids to go to school under those conditions? Now, obviously, you might say, well, yeah, some schools are bad, and you take kids and put them in better conditions. So maybe the answer is not to send kids to work, rather to put kids in other places, other educational places. Now, I mean, another point to make is certainly kids working can help their families. So maybe if you're looking at things from a utilitarian point of view, it's not necessarily just about the kids' welfare, it's about what's good for the family and society. And it may be that the family is better off with the kid working. And then there's the value of work. I mean, I guess if you're like 14 years old, is work going to be interesting? Well, maybe it depends what you're doing, right? Maybe it's educational. Some employers provide education and training, and maybe work provides something else. Maybe it provides like a sort of independence and self-esteem. So maybe work can actually be a useful experience. Now, from a utilitarian point of view, what laws we should have, I mean, it seems pretty obvious we should have laws forbidding abuse and forbidding dangerous work conditions. I guess we might say make a distinction between hazardous and dangerous. You can have some work conditions can be hazardous, but you can be careful about it. But if it's actually dangerous, then we shouldn't be doing that. And maybe especially kids shouldn't be working in hazardous work conditions. Now, I mean, do we have any definite knowledge about what makes a society better? Is it better to have laws forcing kids to go to school, or is it better would it be better to allow kids to go to work? I mean, have studies been done? Is there any good evidence, sociological evidence? I'm not sure. I mean, we have our history to look at. I mean, you might say, well, if abuse is a problem at work and exploitation at work, then we should have laws forbidding exploitation and abuse. So, I mean, it's not clear that we have any good evidence about what the best laws to have are. I mean, if you're choosing between laws, like if you just have a very simple choice between strong labor laws and no labor laws, it's probably better to have strong labor laws. So then you don't allow kids to work. But apart from that, I mean, it's not so clear what laws we should have. How about, so that's utilitarianism. It's not very clear. Virtue ethics is not very useful because it all depends on what virtues you want to have. I mean, virtue ethics doesn't really say much about virtues for kids at all. I guess it has what virtues kids should aim for, like courage and kindness and stuff like that. But none of that seems to say very much about whether you should have a job or not. And then, what about parents who let their kids work or require their kids to work? Does that make them bad people? Well, it's going to depend on circumstances, isn't it? I mean, like, if the only way you can get your family to survive is by sending your kid out to work, maybe you're not such a bad person by sending your kid out to work. So it seems like it's going to be pretty variable. It's hard to have any universal laws there. I mean, virtue ethics says like the wise person knows what to do, but it doesn't give us a lot of information about what it is to be wise. So it's not necessarily very helpful. Now we can think about rights with Kantian approaches, dignity approaches, and that seems to be more useful. And the idea of rights, but exactly what rights should children have? That's not so clear. I mean, Kant says that non-humans don't have rights because they aren't rational. Are kids rational? Well, I mean, young kids are not very rational at all. Older kids are more rational. So it's not clear that kids even have rights at all from a Kantian point of view. We'll say a little bit more about Kant in a second. Now, do all jobs undermine dignity? No. You can retain your dignity and have a job. Are all jobs exploitative? No. Are all jobs exploitative of kids? It's not so clear that that's true. So if you're going to use a Kantian approach, you have to be clear about what's bad about children working in jobs, and you need to sort of spell out what rights that violates. So as I just said, it's not clear that kids have rationality or rights. Now, Kant himself, he was sort of complicated about this. He did say at one point that he thinks that children were ends in themselves, so they had dignity, so it follows from that they should have rights, but it doesn't follow exactly which rights they should have. It doesn't follow they have the right to vote, for instance. And his reasoning was sort of complicated, and he didn't write much about it. So Kant himself is not really very useful. It is worth noting he thought that it was important that children be raised to have self-respect and rationality. So they should become autonomous, and then they will have full rights. So he would be against a society which didn't allow kids to have self-respect and rationality. So if you could make the argument that getting a job was incompatible with self-respect or education, then maybe that would be a good argument against child labor. So, I mean, if you think about it at an intuitive level, I mean, I think it's pretty plausible that children should have rights. Certainly a right to life, so you can't murder them. That seems pretty reasonable. A right not to be abused. A right to sustenance and shelter. They all seem like good rights. What about a right to education? Well, I mean, maybe. It seems like partly it's going to be depending on how rich a society is. If a society is very poor, then maybe it can't afford to educate everybody. I mean, if you think back to Stone Age times, were kids' rights being violated because kids weren't being educated? Well, obviously not. It was the Stone Ages. There wasn't any education. If you think about now, then in the US, we do think kids' rights are violated. So, I mean, exactly what generates a child's rights seems to be partly the society you're in, how rich, how sophisticated the society is. So here's the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is an attempt to give universal rights, to spell out universal rights for children. And this is pretty interesting. So it says that every child has basic rights, including the right to life, the right not to be murdered, the right to their own name and identity, which until reading that, it hadn't even occurred to me, like, oh, you could like not give a child a name. You could just treat it like a farm animal or something like that and never give it a name. So the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child says you have to give a child a name, and you have to give it an identity. So that seems like, that seems good. Seems plausible. And then it also says it has the right to be raised by their parents within a family or cultural grouping. So any society has to allow kids to be raised by their parents. You can't take kids away, and I mean, I guess if the parents aren't there, then you can take, the state can raise the kids. But if a family wants to raise the kid and is capable of doing so, then the child has that right. It also says the child has a right to have a relationship with both parents, even if they are separated, which is interesting. I mean, because I guess these days, I mean, we have some parents who don't want anything to do with their kids. And according to the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, that violates the rights of the child. The convention also says that children have a right to express their opinions and have the right to have those opinions heard and acted upon, and to have their privacy protected, and says they should not be subject to excessive interference. So all of that's sort of a bit vague. I mean, what is appropriate privacy? What's excessive interference? Doesn't really spell that out. So, but that's interesting that they have, the UN says they have those rights. Now, so the UN. The good news is that this UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most ratified UN convention in history. The bad news is the US has refused to ratify it. It's the only country in the West which has refused to sign on to this convention. Like, seriously? What's up with that? I'll leave you to ponder that yourselves. All right, so the UN certainly gives us some plausible rights, but so the UN does not forbid child labor. But it does talk about the rights to education, and or at least some right to education. All right, so seems like certainly we learn something from looking at those moral theories, and it's a useful way of thinking. It doesn't necessarily give us a very clear picture of how we should think about how we should treat children and child labor, but it gives us a way to think, some ways to kind of talk about the morality of child labor. All right, so let's now think about big companies, big international companies, employing workers in poor countries. So you have companies like who are based in the US. You have companies based in China, companies based all over the world who employ children in poor countries. I guess arguably China is a poor country itself, but China also employs countries in poorer countries. So one of the issues is like, well, which moral standards should you use? Because it's a multinational corporation or an international corporation. It has money itself. Should it employ children in poor countries? Obviously, the incentive is you can employ those children for less money than you would do. So in the US, like if in New York, you'd have to, there's minimum wages and things like that. And there's child labor laws. In other countries, there aren't child labor laws. Or if there are child labor laws, they're not really respected. So it leads to a sort of moral quandary. Now, one of the big issues is children working in mines. I'm pretty sure that mines are hazardous, and so maybe in some states, children, 16 and 17-year-olds are allowed to work in mines, but generally not younger than that. And I mean, mines are generally dangerous places, partly because there's mine collapses, also because of all the chemicals that are involved in mining. One of the big issues, and we'll come back to this, is the use of the mining of cobalt. And cobalt is dangerous, but it's used to power mobile phones, laptops, and electric cars. And so that's a big issue. So roughly around 40,000 children work in mines extracting cobalt around the world. Around the world, mines generally, the ILO estimates 1 million children work in mines. So that's not a small number, 1 million children. The UNICEF estimates that 1 in 5 mine workers are children around the world. So these children undergo exploitation. They're exposed to life-threatening chemicals and gases. Children in gold mines get exposed to mercury, which is highly toxic. So it seems like these issues are pretty big problems. Then there's also agricultural work and the clothing industry, sneakers, stuff like that. I mean, there's plenty of countries which have child labor. I chose to focus a little on Mexico. So from what we know about Mexico, 3.1 million children between the ages of 5 and 17 are engaged in child labor. And half of those are in hazardous work. It seems that about a quarter of those kids don't go to school. So it seems like that. Certainly that's different from the US. Estimates are, obviously estimates of modern slavery vary, but so one estimate at least is that about 40 million people, there are about 40 million slaves in the world today. Which is, it's not good. And there are about 152 children in child labor, 152 million children in child labor today around the world. So that's a lot. I mean, we have 8 billion people on the planet, 152 million children in child labor. All right, so some children are forced to work. So that's clear. I mean, clearly, I think we can say that is a basic violation of rights. Certainly, slavery and child slavery is deeply wrong, violation of rights, bad for the children. Certainly, we think that children have a right to be brought up by their parents. So we need to kind of think about these kind of issues, and so there's certainly a bunch of questions for us to ask. Now, I guess one of the big issues is like often the children are not being forced, parents are not being forced to give their children up into work. Rather, families want work. So if families want work, to what extent should companies give them work? And why do they want work? Because they're poor, and maybe they are going to face starvation or terrible conditions if they can't get work. So there's a sort of dilemma, to what extent is it okay for children to be working when it's actually helping the family? So one of the big issues is to what extent should multinational corporations like Tesla, Apple, Samsung, Nike, to what extent should they make sure that none of their products have been created using child labor? Now, if you ask them, they're going to say, to our knowledge, we don't use child labor. But the question is, how much of an effort do they actually make to see whether child labor is involved? Certainly, it seems in many cases there's not a great deal of enforcement by government, and there's a question about how much enforcement, how much effort should the corporation itself make. I mean, certainly it seems like it's more, the plenty of cases of exploitation and slavery that corporations should be involved in. There's also self-interest from corporations, because when it becomes discovered that a corporation is using child labor, then that's very bad publicity for the company. And certainly there have been various cases of big companies in the past being exposed for using child labor. Nike comes to mind, Walmart comes to mind, and they've had bad publicity as a result. And then there's the question about consumers, us. How much effort should we make to make sure none of the products we buy involves child labor? Well, I mean, I guess the obvious answer is, I mean, we don't make much effort because we all have cell phones, and a large proportion of cell phones are made using cobalt, and cobalt is a lot of cobalt comes from use of child labor. So it seems like, you know, we're all somewhat implicated. Now, if you go to buy your cell phone, they don't have two sections like the cheap cell phones made using child labor and the more expensive ones made with no child labor. So it's not like we're given a choice. But you know, and as far as I know, I mean, you know, if you ask the companies, do you use child labor, they're going to say no. So the question is, how much do we believe them? And from the facts that are available, it seems actually that you know, if you look at the numbers, all those kids involved in child labor and in mines, 1 in 5 mine workers are children. And it seems like, you know, obviously there's not a lot of follow-up there. And so, I mean, maybe with some food products, maybe with clothing, you can actually do more to make sure that you don't buy products which are made using child labor. You can, I guess, you can buy used clothes. I guess the clothes may originally have been used by using child labor, but you're paying the thrift store, or you're paying Etsy, or whoever you're paying, somebody on eBay. For food, some food is labeled kind of more like child labor free, and they give some food manufacturers, especially chocolate manufacturers, give guarantees that they weren't made using child labor. But it's not necessarily that easy, and if you go to, and sometimes you still have to sort of search those things out. So certainly it can take a lot of effort to be sure that products have no connection with child labor. So I mean, that's a tricky thing for us to be working out. So as a conclusion, I mean, certainly there may be cases where child labor and children employed by multinational corporations is justified. But clearly, it's something we want to be very careful about, because it seems like it's very likely, or there's a big problem with exploitation of children. And if we want to make sure as consumers that we don't want to support child labor, we have to make a lot of effort, and that's not necessarily very easy.